Oh, welcome everyone to our assessment course podcast. We are excited to continue building on what we've been learning, and how assessment connects to the student learning and effective teaching. Today's episode focuses on chapter 3, what we assess, and clear learning targets. This chapter bring us to some fundamentals and foundation. Before we can start assessing effectively, we have to be clear about exactly what students are supposed to learn. If that target isn't clear, the assessment can't be accurate. This chapter includes 4 targets for us as educators. So we will, one, explain the necessity of clear targets to assessment quality. Two, classify learning targets by type. Three, deconstruct learning targets as needed. And four, select from options for sharing learning targets with students. Each of us will take one of these learning targets and discuss it in more depth, starting with the first one. This chapter connects directly with what we've already learned in chapter 1, where we discussed how assessments must be accurate and purposeful. And in chapter 2, we focused on how assessments should support learning and not just measure it. Now, in this chapter, we're digging into the foundation that makes both of these possible and clear learning targets. I'm Selena Galloway, and I'm joined by my team members, Michael Hoyes, Indy Crudup, and Melissa Heath. We are looking forward to breaking this chapter down, sharing insights, and connecting it with the real life classrooms. So let's get started. I'll start off with lesson target 1. So the first lesson target for this chapter is understanding why clear learning targets are necessary for assessment quality. And honestly, this feels foundational to everything we've talked about so far. The big idea is simple. If we're not clear about what students are supposed to learn, we can't assess it accurately. And when assessment isn't accurate, everything else starts to fall apart. You're all over the place. Our instruction becomes unfocused, and students don't really understand what success looks like. There's no order. A learning target answers 3 basic questions. 1, what should students know? 2, what should they be able to do? And 3, at what level of quality are we expecting? If those things aren't clear, then we might design an assessment that measures the wrong thing. For example, if the goal for students is to analyze and explain their thinking, but the assessment only asks for them to recall facts, we're not actually measuring the intended learning. That leads to misleading results, which then affects how we respond instructionally. Clear learning targets also matter for students, not just for us teachers. If students don't understand the target, they're basically guessing on what the teacher wants. And when students are guessing, that's when motivation drops because they feel like the success is random. But when the learning target is clear and student friendly, they can focus their efforts and monitor their progress and take ownership of their learning. This chapter also emphasizes what learning targets should be. That learning targets should be specific, student centered, and focused on learning, not just activities. So, like, instead of saying we're doing a project, the target might be we're learning how to compare 2 perspectives and using evidence. That clarity changes how both teaching and assessments are designed. I also think that this connects to fairness. When targets are clear, assessment becomes more valid and useful. Students know what they're working toward, and teachers can confidently say whether the learning happened or not. So overall, clear learning targets are the starting point for quality assessment. If the target is fuzzy, the assessment will be fuzzy. When the target is clear, both teacher and learner have direction. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michael for our next target.
Thank you, Selena. So we'll talk about learning target 2, and that's classifying learning targets by type. And I think one of the most helpful ideas in the chapter is the reminder that not all learning targets are the same. So we often talk about standards and objectives as if they're interchangeable, but the authors make a strong case that the type of learning target matters because it determines how we assess. So they identify 5 types of learning targets. You have knowledge, reasoning, performance skills, products, and dispositions. And the reason this classification matters is because assessment methods are not interchangeable. And if we misunderstand the type of learning we are targeting, we're likely to choose an assessment that doesn't actually measure what we think it does. So, for example, knowledge targets can often be assessed through like multiple choice or short written responses, but reasoning targets requires students to explain their thinking. Performance skills require observation over time to see how individuals improve and get better and demonstrate particular skills. And products require clear criteria for quality. Um, Dispositions are sometimes are something else entirely, and often we can't really measure them in the same way that we measure the other targets at all. Things about how students might feel about the content area that they're learning in. Um, and what stood out to me is that many assessment problems don't actually start with bad test questions. They start earlier with a lack of clarity about what kind of learning we're asking students to demonstrate. And if we don't know whether we're assessing reasoning or knowledge, we can easily write an assessment that measures recall when what we really wanted was understanding. And so the authors also emphasize that we should classify the intended learning, not just the activity. Just because students are doing a project, doesn't mean the target is a product. And just because students are writing doesn't mean the target is writing. We have to ask, what is the learning we actually care about here? And so this learning target forces us to slow down and be really precise before we can assess well. We have to be clear about the nature of what we're assessing. And so that clarity doesn't just help with assessment, it sharpens our instruction and our feedback and even how we communicate expectations to our students. So next one, I'll pass it on to Melissa to talk about deconstructing of the learning targets.
Hello. So I did have deconstructing learning targets as needed. And one key idea from this chapter is that standards are often too broadly to be taught, or sorry, let me back it up, are too broad to be taught or assessed directly. The author explains that teachers must unpack or deconstruct standards into smaller, teachable learning targets. So, a powerful metaphor that was used is the idea of pebbles, rocks, and boulders. So, essentially, that is talking about taking a standard or learning target and breaking it down into pebbles because some may already be pebbles or small tasks, while some are larger, and then the really big ones are like boulders. And for me in CTE, they tend to be more on the boulders side. Now, when you break them down, it does allow us as teachers to have smaller items so that students can more realistically understand and work towards those smaller goals that then equal up to a bigger goal. One quote that I really like from the author was, standards are not written in a way that makes them immediately teachable. Um, this really resonated, especially with a CTE class, because they are very broad and usually come with many smaller parts to them. Um, so with that deconstructive and how it relates to the assessment is that when the targets are smaller and easier for students to grasp and learn, you can check the understanding of those smaller chunks before doing a very broad across the board assessment. And it improves with our instructional planning as we build from those smaller little pebbles um, to get to the bigger main objective. So if students don't or if teachers don't unpack their standards what can happen is students lack parts of that standard that they need for their understanding. So while they may have parts 3, 5, and 9, they may be missing 2 and 4 and 6, 8. So it's important to make our lessons that then coincide with our assessments on a manageable scale for students to understand and properly comprehend and learn. And I'm going to pass it on to Indy for number 4.
Thank you, Melissa. All right, so I had learning target number 4, which was select from options. For sharing learning targets with students. This section built off of what we learned in chapter 1, where teachers have a clear vision of the intended learning and share that vision with students at the outset of instruction. If your school district is anything like mine, or just a school period, it's required that we have our learning targets or objectives posted somewhere that is visible to the students and administration or visitors. And though this is a good practice, which the chapter pointed out, it does not fulfill our requirement as educators to share or communicate our learning targets to our students. This section informed us of the best strategies that we can utilize to help us share our learning targets with our students, such as 1, sharing the target as is, 2, converting terms of the target to a student-friendly language, and 3, sharing a student-friendly version of a rubric. For the first one where it says share the target as is, sorry, y'all. This practice is mainly used with targets that relate to knowledge or reasoning. Converting your targets to I can statements is very beneficial in aiding students for comprehension of their learning targets. For the second one, which was convert terms in the target to a student-friendly language. This strategy is great for reasoning targets. In this practice, we take the terms from a learning target that students may be unfamiliar with and simplify the terminology so that they can understand it. The text suggests that we follow these steps. 1, identify the word or words in the learning target that would benefit from clarification. The second step is to define the word or words. You can use a dictionary, a textbook, content standards, or other references that are related to your specific subject. You can convert the definition. Well, the third step is convert the definition into language students will understand if they're not there already. We can utilize the models provided in the text, such as I am learning blank. This means I'm learning to blank. Or I can blank, and this means I can blank. The fourth step was to try the definition out with some students and adjust as needed to ensure understanding. So check and make sure that the kids are getting the correct definition when presented. Sorry about that. I'm going to lose my place. So yeah, try the definition out to make sure that students are understanding it. Then let students try this process with a pattern of reasoning you think they could successfully define and paraphrase. And then the last step, moving on from the convert terms, the next part was share a student-friendly version of a rubric with your students. This strategy is best for reasoning, performance skill, and product targets. And a rubric lists the criteria for a strong response, product, or performance and describes each criterion. The most important thing is that the rubric that you use accurately describes the features of quality with respect to the learning target and is written so that students can understand it. And in the end, when to share the target and how to check for understanding, the point in which you share your learning target can vary and is up to you ultimately. However, it is important that you inform the students of the learning targets before you ask them to complete any independent work. It is also good practice to periodically check in with students to see if they are aware of the intended learning of an activity. So ask questions like, why are we doing this activity? If they're unable to tell you, then you need to restate restate and clarify it for them. Another good practice would be incorporating exit tickets or slips, where you can have students complete prompts such as, why did we do such and such activity today? And lastly, you can incorporate your learning targets by phrasing it as a question that students should be able to answer at the end of the lesson through written or verbal submission in some cases. All right, and with that, I'm going to pass it back to mostly Selena for our first one. I think so.
Yes, I got it. Thank you. So, all great points, all great discussion points with the learning target. So now we're going to go into our reflection portion, and I'll go ahead and start that off with our reflection. I had the most convincing or useful ideas that we took from this. So, one of the most useful ideas from chapter 3 for me was the emphasis on making learning targets clear and student friendly. That really stood out because I've seen what happens when students don't know what the goal is or what to do. They do the work, but they're not always sure why they're doing the work or what success actually looks like. The chapter made the point that learning targets should focus on learning, not just activities. That's practical for me. It's easy to say we're doing a project or we're completing the assignment, but that doesn't tell the students what they're supposed to learn. When I shift to saying, today we're learning about how to compare ideas, or we're learning how to explain our thinking with evidence, it changes the focus from just finishing the work to actually understanding. Another idea that felt really useful was classifying learning targets by type. The knowledge, reasoning, performance skills, product, and even dispositions. This stood out because um, it explains why sometimes an assessment doesn't match the learning. If the goal isn't reasoning, but I give them a recall quiz, if the goal is reasoning, but then I give them a recall quiz, I'm not really seeing what students can do. Knowing the type of target helps me choose the right kind of assessment needed, instead of just defaulting to what's easy to grade. I also connected with the idea that clear learning targets support student motivation, and I'm huge on motivation. When students know the target, learning feels less mysterious. They're not trying to figure out what the teacher wants. They actually know what they're working toward. That builds confidence, especially for students who already doubt themselves. I see this with my own students when I break tasks down and explain the goal clearly. Even my struggling learners are more willing to try. And finally, the idea that clear targets can actually mislead teachers really hit me. When we might think students don't understand the content when really they just assess the wrong thing. That reminder makes me want to be more intentional about aligning targets, instructions, and assessment. So overall, the most convincing idea for me is that clear learning targets aren't just helpful, but they're necessary. They guide teaching, make assessments more accurate, and help students feel more confident about what they're learning. And then we're gonna go into the next reflection question, which I think is Indy.
It is, sorry. I had too many tabs open. All right, so the next one was alignment with beliefs. So, how does this chapter align with or challenge your beliefs about teaching and learning? And what I wrote was, as I was reading chapter 3, I found myself nodding along a lot, because so much of what it discusses really aligns with how I already view teaching and learning. The chapter emphasizes the importance of clear learning targets and how they should guide instruction and assessment, and that really resonated with me. I strongly believe that learning has to be intentional. Students shouldn't be guessing what they're supposed to be learning or why it matters. One point that really stood out to me was the idea that simply posting learning objectives isn't enough. That honestly hit home. In many schools, including my own, we're required, like I said before, to have objectives posted, but the chapter challenges us to go a step further and actually communicate those targets in a way students understand. That aligns with my belief that students should be active participants in their learning, not just passive recipients of information. I see this play out in my own classroom, especially in my digital media and design courses. For example, instead of just posting a standard objective like students will apply design principles to create a visual product, I take time to break it down with students. Sorry. I take time to break it down with students into an I can statement and connect it directly to what they're working on. I'll say something like, by the end of the day, you should be able to explain why you chose certain colors and layouts and how they connect with, connect to your target audience. When I do that, I notice students ask better questions, make more intentional design choices, and are more confident explaining their work. The chapters break down the different types of learning targets, knowledge, reasoning, performance skills, products, and dispositions. Also made me reflect on how I assess students. In design-based classes, a written test can only tell so much, but students really show their understanding through creating, revising, and presenting their work. This chapter pushed me to think more intentionally about whether my assessments truly match the kind of learning I'm expecting from them. Sorry. And then there's the focus on dispositions, which really spoke to me. I've seen firsthand how confidence and motivation impact student success. When students understand the learning target and feel supported, they're more willing to take creative risks and stick with challenging tasks. That's especially important in classes where students may already doubt their abilities or feel intimidated by creative work. Overall, this chapter validated a lot of my existing beliefs, but it also pushed me to be more intentional about how I design learning targets, communicate them clearly, and align them with meaningful assessments that truly reflect student learning. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Melissa for strategy you'd implement.
Thank you. So a strategy I would implement was talked mainly about by Michael, where the type of learning target should be identified before you start planning for the betterment of both the lesson and the assessment. And when Michael was talking about it and when I read about it, it made me think a lot about the Bloom's taxonomy chart and how, as you go up, identifying whether it's a skill, a product, um, recall, understanding, and being able to identify that within the standard helps us as teachers to not only better teach, but have those assessments more doable. And so that is the strategy, and how I would implement it was talked about, and I heard someone mention about exit tickets. I'm going to try to implement more exit tickets because my class is project based. So it might be good to have an exit ticket when they're working on a project for two, 2 to 3 days to keep up with their understanding. And so I will try to understand better what the learning target is and make sure that it is in a doable chunk before I begin my planning. And I'm going to pass it on. I'm going to pass it on.
Alrighty. So I had hesitation and the things that are, I guess, they're uncertain in my mind about implementation, I suppose. And so one place where I feel real hesitation with this chapter is not whether I believe in clear learning targets, because that's not a question. It's more the consistently being able to externalize them in ways that students can use independently. And so, like, as a math teacher, I spend a lot of time thinking about learning goals and the planning process because I want to have much more discourse in my classroom. And so, in many ways, I'm very clear about the target that I want to have by the end of my class. But the chapter makes me ask the question of, are students as clear about the learning target as I am? And so because I like on having on discourse and questioning and real-time adjustments to kind of guide students toward the goal, what I don't always do is formalize that target into student-friendly language or tools like rubrics that students can reference without me. And so that's where the tension kind of sits for me. Um, Even when I try to translate student standards into student-friendly language, I find that I still might end up using, or will definitely will end up using, um, really mathematically precise terms. Um, while the students are in the process of learning those terms. And so if I simplify it too much, I risk really distorting the mathematics. Um, but if I keep the mathematics, I risk them like losing the students and then their understanding of what the target is saying. So then I start to wonder, when does student-friendly language begin to come at the expense of mathematically accurate language? Um, or for any subject area of like content specific accuracy in their language. And the book talks about testing the language on students. But I mean, who got that? Who got kids to sit test targets on at the ready before you teach a lesson? I mean, that's not even realistic. And so what it means is like this process can take years to kind of do and refine. It's not something that can be perfected across, a single course cycle. Um, and it means that the implementation of these things is going to be really messy in the beginning, and so it's tempting to kind of avoid formalizing the target altogether, and just kind of rely on what I normally go back to, just like a lot of discourse, a lot of questioning, a lot of explaining. And so one thing I do appreciate that the chapter kind of does is it doesn't really assume that targets will get it, teachers will get it right immediately. The steps that they give for implementation of the learning targets are not about perfection, but rather iteration. And the authors suggest first, classifying the target, deconstructing it, finally putting attention to how students are responding to the way it's written. And that last step is really important, paying attention to how the students respond to it. They don't say, write the perfect student-friendly target. They say, in essence, try it. How do the kids respond to it, and then revise it? And so that helps alleviate some of the tension, because my hesitation comes from feeling like this has to be done well um, before it's worth doing it all. And I don't know if that's some of the accuracy that's required in mathematics requires me to be right all the time, to make sure that things are doing well. But the chapter really reframes this as a long-term refinement process. And so over time, teachers begin to see where students get confused by language, if the target is too broad or maybe even too narrow, or where it doesn't really match the learning that they intended. And those observations provide feedback into improving the learning targets. So the process becomes less about, creating flawless learning targets in the beginning and up front, but more about treating them as instructional tools that improve through use. And so that makes it feel much more realistic. And instead of needing like a bevy of kids to test my thoughts on before I teach a class, the classroom itself becomes the testing ground. The students I already have become like the feedback loop for myself. And that reframes the work from being an additional burden to being part of, my own reflective process over time. Um, that's all I got for my hesitation. But if anybody got anything else you want to add in there, feel free to take the floor. If not, we'll pass it on to Selena to go ahead and close this thing up.
Okay, so nobody has any more reflection to anybody else's reflection before we close it out. I was going to say, I think everybody did a good job explaining each section. I think each part has, come together with all the chapters. So that's the case. So as we wrap up chapter 3, I guess the big takeaway is pretty simple. Clear learning targets drive everything. The guide for our instruction, making our assessments more accurate and help students actually understand what they're doing. We're not all over the place. When students know the target, learning feels like what they say, more like success versus guessing. And as teachers, it helps us make better decisions about how we teach and how we do assess. Thank you for listening to our discussion. Again, I'm Selena. I have Michael, Indy, and Melissa. We're all doing this thing together, trying to do good or better as teachers. And we look forward to talking to you again. So we'll see you next episode.